Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. We're delighted to welcome today Nellie Reid, who has spoken to us before at SCSI. Nellie is the Managing Director of Meehan Green, which is a very well regarded sustainability consultancy in Dublin. Nellie actually moved into the world of LEED very early on in around 2001. She was one of the first accredited LEED accredited professionals in the world. And she worked in the US for a number of years as a director of sustainable design at Gensler, dealing with multinational projects at 35 offices worldwide. She's served as a sustainable design consultant at over 100 LEED projects around the world. And Nellie moved to Ireland in 2011 and worked for a number of years as a sustainability consultant before forming the company of Meehan Green in 2016. So we're delighted to welcome Nellie here today, and I'll hand over to Nellie. Thank you, Nellie.
Thank you, Christina. And I'm glad I can join you all virtually. I wish we were there in person because it's always better to be presenting to a live audience. And now I can't even see on my screen there, Christina, who's participating, but I assume that the participants are all they're all online. Yes. Okay. So can everyone see can you see my screen okay, Christina? Does everything look okay? I'm going to go ahead then. I'm going to be talking about a few different certification schemes at a larger scale. Last week was World Green Building Week, and I know there was a lot of movement on social media and in different building industry circles about different companies making commitments to advancing net zero and getting towards carbon neutral buildings. And although it's, all that focus was on kind of the building scale, and I just wanted to open up the conversation into the broader perspective of what we can be doing at the community and city scale to be looking at making a difference in terms of sustainability and actually going through a third-party certification to document the progress we're making at the city and community scale. So just to put it in context for Ireland, because I know the participants here are working on projects in Ireland. Last year, Ireland issued a climate action plan in 2019, and one of the important sectors, or one of the important areas of focus of the climate action plan, was the built environment. So just to put in context, there are all the different industries from agriculture, transportation, people in the energy sector are all now focused on looking at how they're going to get towards this goal of carbon neutral by 2050. Now, it's an EU target and an Ireland target to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. What we've seen in the last year is some private entities, the private sector has been making commitments to reach carbon neutral by 2030 as a way of differentiating themselves from the EU directive of reaching that carbon neutral goal by 2050. So in the climate action plan, they've set kind of these incremental targets. And along the way, some of the most important things that we're starting to see a lot of conversation about just in the last year is getting away from fossil fuel use in buildings. And that needs to happen at scale. It doesn't just happen at a building by building level, but we have to look at it from a community and city planning scale of how we're going to be basically getting off our addiction to fossil fuels and focusing on electricity and renewable sources of electricity for our buildings. And that's all in an effort to kind of get to this climate neutral or carbon neutral goal. And another important part, just to make there another important statement, is that we're not just focused on new buildings, but existing buildings. In our cities and communities, we have a lot of existing buildings that are underperforming and that are not actively involved in increasing their performance to help achieve these goals. We cannot achieve carbon neutrality just by focusing on new buildings. We have to look at existing buildings as well. And in addition to the carbon neutral goals, another big thing is just looking at biodiversity and, you know, what's happening in Ireland in terms of climate change and biodiversity and destruction of natural environments. And, you know, without bees, they're not pollinating things, and without the pollination, we're not, the crops aren't succeeding. So, you know, it all ties down to our access to food and also the biodiversity of all animals in Ireland. And this is really kind of the biggest wave. Like, if there was a diagram recently about how COVID-19 is a certain kind of crisis we're dealing with right now, and then the recession, the economy is the next big crisis. And then on top of that is climate change. And on top of that, even bigger is biodiversity. So, you know, with biodiversity collapse, that's kind of the biggest thing that we need to be focusing on now, even beyond just looking at carbon neutral. And we see this every day. You know, you hear it in the news every week with flooding, storms. You know, Storm Ellen created power outages all over Ireland, and there was massive flooding, especially in coastal areas and low-lying areas. This image on the left is even just Lewis in Dublin, and you know, the image on the right is in Cork. So, you know, these flood events are becoming even more critical, and so we need to be thinking about how we're developing to address change, because these extreme weather events are becoming more and more of a daily and yearly occurrence. So thinking beyond just the buildings, the US Green Building Council that created the LEED rating system has developed LEED for cities and communities. And you may have heard, I think there was a presentation recently to this group on what's going on at Cherrywood, and they're looking at LEED for neighborhood development and WELL. So wellness is part of this discussion as well. LEED and WELL have synergies between the two rating systems. People are starting to look at these certification systems from a bigger scale. And GBCI is the Green Business Certification Institute, and they're the entity that certifies buildings for LEED and WELL. So I'm in part kind of spreading the awareness of this organization, the Green Business Certification Institute, as they now have a location in Europe. So there is an entity called GBCI Europe. They're based in Germany, Munich, Germany. And all of the green building councils, the Irish Green Building Council and other national green building councils, are in collaboration with GBCI and the World Green Building Council. LEED for cities. So looking at, you know, it's the LEED for Cities program has only been around for a few years. And, you know, it's a great opportunity for cities like Dublin, but also Cork, Limerick, Galway, to think about how they might be able to promote themselves on the international scale by pursuing LEED certification at the city scale. So again, it all ties back to this roadmap to 2050. When I was talking about the Ireland Climate Action Plan, how everything's leading towards how do we get from 2020 to 2050? And, you know, what are the things that we need to do along that way? And in the United States, there's an organization called the Covenant of Mayors. The mayors are all of the mayors of cities in the United States, and they've all come together in kind of this void of any kind of federal guidance in the United States. The mayors have taken upon themselves to look at how they can be greening their cities in a voluntary way because there's a lack of kind of policy making at the federal level in the United States. And so even though LEED, sometimes people think it's a very US-centric rating system, it's being used in 171 countries around the world. It was actually a target last year to try to have a LEED building in every country in the world, and they're getting closer to that, especially with an increase in LEED certifications in Europe and the Middle East. And so because LEED has been such a vast, there's been such a quick adoption of LEED across the world at the building scale, now they're looking at this kind of community and city scale as well. And just in terms of where Ireland fits in, looking back at the history of LEED certification in Ireland, we're actually doing pretty well in terms of the number of LEED buildings based on as compared to population. So, you know, it's interesting to look at the number of LEED buildings compared to the millions of people in the country. Ireland's actually doing pretty well in terms of density of LEED buildings per person. So LEED for Cities looks at some of the broader issues around green building and sustainability, and it deals with a lot of UN sustainability goals that are beyond just carbon and resilience, but looking at social equity and safety and health. So especially now with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's this increased concern about the health of occupants in buildings and in cities and when using public transit. And so LEED for Cities looks at that as well, as how are you accounting for public health in cities and also creating positive economic sustainability for the cities. So some of the participating cities, quite a few of them, as you can see there, are based in the United States, but there are LEED cities in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe as well, and South America. So 15 countries, 160 registered cities in the program. In the United States, of course, you can see they're all over the map, and those are the cities that are either registered or certified under the program. And some of the benefits, you know, I was thinking about this in terms of why would a city in Ireland pursue LEED certification? But we're now in this global economy where one of the biggest concerns businesses have is attracting and retaining talent. Because if you own a business and you want your business to succeed, your highest expense is your staff and the people that work for your company. And that's also where you have, you know, the whole productivity of your company is based on your people and having the best people that you can get from around the world. And there's been research that diverse, you know, companies with diverse skill sets and people from diverse backgrounds bring the most innovation to their companies, and the most successful companies have diverse employment and diverse employment within their company. So LEED certification for cities is a way to attract people from all over the world to come to the city and work there, because it shows that it's a city that's committed to creating a good place for people to live and work and to enjoy their lives. And so, but it's also good in terms of benchmarking, like as cities are trying to look at how they can meet their carbon goals or their sustainability goals. LEED certification provides this third-party validation to those goals. So again, looking back at the UN Sustainable Development Goals is a really good way to look at, you know, how are these things aligning? Why is a third-party certification important for a city? But it's a way to show and validate that you're addressing all of these different issues. And these are things that all the countries in the UN are working towards achieving these Sustainable Development Goals. And so part of the LEED Cities program that's interesting is that it's a continuous improvement process. So you don't just get your plaque and put it on City Hall and walk away from it. The idea is that you're supporting continuous progress. And so once you're in the LEED for Cities program, you, through the ARC platform, which I'll discuss, you're able to actually show how you're improving every year. And so those incremental changes are really important to benchmark and to be able to report on how you're improving the quality of life in your city and how you're improving on reducing the carbon footprint and looking at transportation and the performance of the buildings in that city. And it's a flexible and scalable platform. So, Meehan Green is working with a lot of developers on new buildings and looking at their portfolios. But by looking at LEED certification for those buildings and those portfolios, that information that we're collecting on those projects can feed into this LEED for Cities program. So let's say you've got 10 developers in Ireland and they're all using the LEED certification system and they're feeding into the ARC platform. That can then feed into this LEED for Cities reporting. So it really all feeds into this kind of accumulative reporting and measuring success and looking at these quantitative and qualitative measures of performance. And again, it all comes down to people. Like, if you have the best people working for you, your company's going to succeed, our communities are going to thrive. And so that's what this all comes down to. And, better buildings create better lives. We spend so much of our time in our buildings that, often it's said that your facilities manager has more impact on your health than your GP or your fitness trainer. Like, you can go to the gym 1 hour a day and do your workout, and you can go to your GP once every 6 months for a checkup, but your facilities manager impacts your life every day. And even though now we're working from home quite a bit, employers can be doing things to be supporting their employees working from home and ensuring that they have a good work environment, even if it is in their home or in a satellite or a smaller office closer to their homes. So some of the different metrics are similar to what you would see at a building scale or a portfolio scale, but it's looking at some of the very quantitative things like energy use in buildings and the carbon emissions associated with that, water consumption, waste generated, but it also looks at transportation. So for LEED for Cities, they're going to look at, how many people are driving single-use vehicles to commute to work versus how many are taking public transit. It looks at education. So these are things that go way beyond the building scale, but looking at what types of education is available to people in that city. And, when you look at the cities in Ireland, they would inherently score very well, I think, in these categories because of the quality education available in Ireland. Some countries in the world, because LEED for Cities is global, not every country in the world has access to education the way we do in Ireland. So, there's definitely an advantage here to kind of, we'd be working off of a good baseline to begin with in Ireland. And then also looking at equity in terms of, what's the availability of affordable housing. And we see now with Dublin doing a lot of work in focusing on building more affordable housing and also student housing and, different types of housing for different types of families and based on income and looking at, can people afford to live in the cities or do they have to live far away from the city and then commute in? So these are all things that kind of relate to each other. And then prosperity, looking at the median incomes, unemployment rates, and health and safety. So looking at what's happening with COVID-19 and the pandemic, we're much more acutely aware of the air quality, both indoors and outdoors, in terms of the spread of contaminants and viruses in buildings and on public transit. And, you know, in places like California recently with all the wildfires, they've been looking at, you know, a diminished kind of outdoor air quality. My sister, for example, lives in San Francisco. You know, her daughter has asthma, and the question is it healthier for her to be in her house, in her school, or outside? And with all the wildfires and viruses, you know, what's the better environment? Is it indoor or outdoor? And how are we dealing with creating healthy spaces for people? And violent crime is a factor in this too. So in Lead for Cities, they also look at crime rates in cities and, you know, is it a safe place to live? And that's also what people are looking for. So in terms of the credit categories, it's a little broader than LEED for buildings because it doesn't just look at the energy use and the materials and the indoor air quality and the water efficiency, but it's also looking at transportation and land uses. So at the master planning scale and urban planning scale, you know, how are you looking at smarter use of public transit and bicycle friendly communities and walkability and even bicycle safety, things like that. And then just the use of materials isn't just looking at buildings, but roads and infrastructure and, you know, where are we sourcing the materials for all the infrastructure in our cities as well. So you know, how in Lead for Cities would you engage with the city or a community? But the idea is that it's not just a one-off. Again, it's not just getting a plaque and putting it on the wall and saying we're a LEED city and we're gonna just go on from there. The idea is to create these policies and plans that align with the Lead for Cities rating system. And then once those plans are in place and you're in the Lead for Cities program, so you're registered in the program, the idea is to then implement some of those strategies and start tracking your performance. So through the ARC platform, which is this performance tracking tool that the U.S. Green Building Council and LEED have adopted, you would be able to track your performance of all of those different indicators. And then you would recertify on a continuing basis. So again, it wouldn't be just a one-off certification. You would track your progress and then there'd be a continuous improvement loop there as well. And so without going into a lot of the details, because we can all be kind of overwhelmed by looking at scorecards day in and day out, but there is a good structure to this. And I think the important thing here is that it just creates one universal structure for cities to look at in terms of how they're addressing sustainability at a city and community scale. And so the structure is part of what's helpful, because often when we think about sustainability at a city scale, you think, well, how do we track that? You know, how do we evaluate one city versus another city? And so this is just a way of kind of standardizing the metrics across the globe. And it's very similar to the way the LEED rating system would be structured for buildings, where you've got different thresholds for certified silver, gold, and platinum. And that way it's very similar and an easy kind of certification system for people who are already familiar with LEED for buildings to kind of grasp that same concept for cities. And so just to give some examples of what's going on in terms of cities adopting LEED, the first city in Europe to adopt LEED was the city of Savona in Italy. And so this is just to show that, you know, there are European cities looking at this. And as I said before, there are quite a few, the numbers increasing all the time on the number of cities and communities participating in the program. And you don't have to just, participation in the program is actually quite simple. And then the certification process is ongoing. So it'd be quite easy to kind of get cities to begin to participate in the program and begin to report and factor into that process. So then if you look at all of the cities that are participating in the LEED for Cities program, it's nearly 53 million people that are, basically represented in the LEED for City program. Washington, D.C. in the United States is one of the participants in the program and is in the LEED for Cities program. So, it is interesting to see that even capital cities are looking at this as an important metric. So in terms of the performance scores, it's very similar to what's happening with LEED for buildings and portfolios, in that it's this continuous improvement loop of measuring your progress towards energy, water, waste, human experience. And, I think the human experience part is really important too, is just, especially now with Dublin being in lockdown and thinking, well, what is the human experience in a city when we're all being told to stay put and not be moving around as much? But that does all tie into this, even with myself struggling to figure out, do you take public transit? Is it healthy to take public transit? Should we be, more of us be riding our bikes to work? Should we be walking to work? Do people live close enough to work? One of the things that's really important with that, the affordability of housing, is if you can get people to live closer to where they work, then it cuts down on their commute and the carbon emissions associated with their commute. So these things are all tied together, and by looking at things at a city scale, you're more likely to actually see incremental progress than just at a building scale. So the idea is to have this kind of structured engagement with cities and communities over time, as I mentioned earlier. Now, just to kind of change course a little bit, and in addition to looking at LEED at the city scale, I know that you've had presentations and you've seen information over the last year about WELL certification in buildings. But there is now a WELL portfolio program, which, again, this is just starting to scale up. With LEED, there were LEED buildings and LEED campuses, LEED portfolios, and then it turned into LEED for neighborhood development and LEED for cities. WELL is kind of going on that same kind of trajectory. So right now, WELL has been scaling up from, LEED for individual projects to looking at WELL community and WELL portfolio certification. So we're watching that kind of follow the same path, and the two are aligned. The Green Business Certification Institute, which I mentioned earlier, is the entity that certifies buildings and communities and cities for both LEED and WELL. So if you're wondering what the connection is between LEED and WELL, they both go through a similar third-party certification system. And whereas LEED is more focused on the environment, WELL is more focused on people, but there are synergies between the two. So, there is this potential for alignment. If cities in Ireland were to look at LEED, it could also help them with promoting wellness in those cities as well. And just in case any of you weren't familiar with the global impact of WELL, there are thousands of WELL projects all over the world, 48 countries. So again, this is following that same trajectory of LEED. It's just maybe a decade behind. So even though LEED started in 2001, the WELL movement started more within the last decade. So it's kind of following on that same course of global influence. And in Europe, there are over 300 WELL projects. Even though there's only a few WELL certified projects in Ireland, quite a few of our clients are pursuing both LEED and WELL for their buildings and portfolios, as they see the benefit in having both of those third-party certifications. And part of why we're seeing more and more commitments to LEED and WELL certification is because they feed into the GRESB reporting, which a lot of our clients are looking at. So GRES is the Global Real Estate Sustainable Building Benchmark Program. So it's an ESG, environmental social government benchmark for real estate. So people who manage real estate portfolios are reporting for GRES on an annual basis. And only one little part of that pie is the building certification side of things. So as buildings get certified under WELL and LEED, that helps private developers in their reporting for GRES. So all these things kind of tie together because, you know, if we look at LEED for cities and kind of that trickling back down to the building level, just thinking that that helps the private industry in terms of the private sector reporting their GRES reports as well. So even though LEED for cities may be thought of as like a public sector initiative, it also helps the private sector with their reporting too, because they're all linked together. And just in terms of the GRES market growth, GRES has been around for about 10 years. And it started out with about 200 participants, and now there's, this was actually in 2018. I think in 2019, this last cycle of reporting, it hit over 1,000 participants, many of whom are in Ireland. So some of the major developers and portfolio managers in Ireland are in the GRES reporting. Now, just something to kind of bring it out to a bigger perspective, because I think in the last month, I've seen quite a bit on social media about getting to zero. And, you know, in Ireland a few years ago, everybody was talking about nearly zero energy building, NZEB, nearly zero energy buildings. Well, as soon as we came out with NZEB as basically building regulation or compliance, suddenly everyone's saying, okay, now we need to actually just focus on getting to zero, not nearly zero, but zero. And to kind of put this in perspective in terms of a scale, if buildings are just meeting building code or Part L or nearly zero energy buildings, they still have a negative impact. So in that orange section there, that negative environmental impact, so you're basically having less of a negative impact. Green buildings are, again, kind of a lower negative environmental impact. High performing buildings, maybe getting towards LEED Gold, LEED Platinum, you're getting closer to this middle of the curve. But really, when we get to that, where that green part of the curve and the orange part of the curve meet, that's zero energy buildings. So zero energy certification, zero carbon certification, these are certification systems by the International Living Building Institute, which is another entity altogether. But they're the organization that created the Living Building Challenge, which is getting to these zero energy, zero carbon buildings, and looking at buildings that only have a positive impact. So imagine going beyond zero and actually having a benefit to the environment, actually improving our environment, improving biodiversity. You know, you hear about green roofs in Dublin and promoting bees and pollinations and creating ecosystems on the roofs of our buildings. Those are things that have a positive impact. Or let's say a company in Ireland decides to actually build enough new photovoltaics that they're providing more energy than they use in their buildings. That's a positive impact. So even with everything we're talking about with LEED and WELL and reducing your environmental impact, let's start thinking about how can we actually be giving back and improving the environment and improving, you know, actually instead of just getting to zero carbon, reducing our carbon footprint as a whole in our country. Because once we get to zero, where do we go from there? You know, once we get to our 2030 target of net zero energy, what happens next? And that's this Living Building Challenge. So it's something to kind of keep in mind that there are now with the Living Building Challenge, so looking at living building communities and how do we create a living building community, living communities. Now, this was just a little bit more about, in case anyone's interested, about who was using WELL in Ireland, because it is still quite new. I put their office in Dublin is certified, as well as Arup's office in Cork. And actually just a few weeks ago, we worked with Iconic Offices on the first WELL certified service office in Ireland. That's Lennox on Richmond Street. So it's the first serviced office building in all of Europe, actually, to achieve WELL certification. So Ireland is really kind of making headlines in terms of adopting WELL certification. And we have quite a few clients who are pursuing WELL at their whole portfolio scale. And I imagine you had a presentation recently, I think, about Cherrywood, but they're looking at WELL certification as well. So just to fold it all back together to try to tie together the building certifications to the cities and the community scale, you know, it's all coming back to just this continuous improvement cycle and performance reporting. So it used to be with LEED certification that you would document one building and submit all the certification in binders, you know, and people would review it and say, okay, you've got your LEED certification. And it was kind of a one-off, very finite thing. Then in 2009, LEED went online and it became much more interactive and easier to upload information. And in 2019, with the ARC platform, it has suddenly opened up the doors to not just inputting data at the building scale, but being able to input and track data at a building scale, a portfolio scale, at an entire city scale. And you can actually start to look at data of buildings across the city in the ARC platform, and participating in LEED for Cities kind of facilitates the sharing of data across different industries as well. So LEED version 4.1 is the current version of LEED, and that's powered by the ARC platform. So, you know, all of these things are starting to kind of feed into each other. And the great thing about the ARC platform is it's something that you can look at from your phone or your laptop or your iPad, and you can actually go in and look at how your buildings are performing. We're working with one portfolio right now in Ireland where they are tracking their existing buildings in the ARC platform. And it's very interesting to actually track progress post-occupancy. So it's not just your LEED certification as a one-time thing, but looking at it as a continuous improvement cycle. And all of the different LEED certification systems kind of feed into this ARC platform. And again, not just focusing on new construction, but existing buildings. You know, let's say you've got 20 buildings in our portfolio and you've been focusing on LEED certification on your existing buildings. Well, you can also feed all of your existing assets into this ARC platform, and that can all feed into the scale of the platform. And again, it's all about being able to manage the data, identify where there's areas of improvement, and compare buildings to each other and compare cities to each other. And, you know, entry into the platform, or to register a project or register a city for LEED, it's very simple to get into the program. And once you're in the program, then you start uploading more information and explaining, you know, what the incremental improvements are per year. And the scoring is very simple. It's for certification, similar to the way LEED certification works at the building level. 40 out of 100 points is certified, and then there's incremental levels from there. And the other thing is looking at how all of this information can then be used by partner programs. So, for example, for people that are reporting their GRESB scores, they may be using different types of partners who are collecting the data and doing things with the data for GRESB reporting. So all of these scores kind of feed into those partner data. So it's really about how do you manage this information in a way that it becomes useful and that you can report on it in a way that becomes useful for different stakeholders. So, you know, the first step in this whole process for portfolio managers or communities or cities is to look at LEED certification at a building by building scale. You know, get your buildings in the LEED system, in the ARC system. Then recognizing progress, looking at how you're incrementally improving over time. And the idea of the incremental progress is it suddenly doesn't seem like this huge leap to get to LEED certification or to get to net zero. There's incremental things that you can be doing along the way. And, you know, even if your buildings go from LEED certified to silver to gold to platinum, you can actually start seeing how you're reducing your carbon footprint of buildings over time based on their score. And it's not just building related energy and emissions, but community related emissions, the transportation, you know, looking at the carbon footprint of transportation and also the human experience, occupant satisfaction. And portfolios, you know, just on the more private sector side of things, LEED for Cities is more public sector, but they are all linked together through this ARC platform. But the idea on the portfolio side is up until now, portfolio managers have been kind of cherry picking their favorite projects. You know, they always have that poster child for this is our LEED platinum building, or we put a green roof on this one building, we're great. But now it's kind of looking at, well, how do you look at all of your buildings and improve the performance of all of those buildings and start thinking about, you know, the broader picture of how your employees are getting to work. What are you doing as a building manager or an employer to promote the use of public transit to reduce the carbon footprint of the transportation related to your business, not just the building itself. So just in terms of this ARC platform and why I'm kind of keep coming back to it, is that there's 88 countries in the world who are contributing to data in this ARC platform. And so once we start seeing ourselves in context with everyone else, it becomes much more interesting to look at, you know, what is the carbon footprint of buildings in Ireland versus the United States versus South America versus Africa. And we can actually start seeing, you know, where the incremental progress is. Now, Ireland, in terms of its uptake in the ARC platform, and obviously there are no LEED for Cities yet in Ireland, but we would love to see more users in Ireland getting into the ARC platform, whether it be through LEED O&M, LEED Portfolio, the LEED for Cities program. In any way that we can feed into this database, it helps on a global level to track the performance of buildings and cities and our goals towards meeting carbon neutral by 2050. So I'll leave it with you there because I want to make sure we have time for any questions. Thanks for the time. And this is a context of our team, if anyone wants to get in touch with me or anyone else on our team. And Christina, do you?
Yeah, that's fantastic, Nellie. Thank you very much for a fascinating overview of sustainability at scale. I'd invite any of the attendees who have questions to put them into the Q&A box. I see we've one question there already, but I might just start off by asking you, you mentioned Dublin, and I suppose it sounds like Dublin would be a great candidate for LEED for Cities. How do we start? Who does it? Who does it? Is it the City Council? Who makes the application?
Yeah, it would have to be, you'd have to have the city government, City and County Council of Dublin would need to be on board. Now, I did, in the last year, we've kind of promoted the LEED for Cities program in other cities in Ireland, such as Limerick and Cork. And there were, we had Kai Kilman from GBCI Europe was here last year and presented down in Cork and in Limerick, specifically kind of talking about how we would engage with those cities in getting into the program. but that was right before the pandemic hit. So I think, you know, everyone's been kind of in this emergency mode of let's just get through 2020. But I think very quickly when people get back to some sort of normalcy and we can meet with city and county councils, I think that that's, you know, it's basically getting them on board and getting the policies in place. There's basically just a few kind of, you know, policies that would need to be in place at the city level to get registered into the program.
Okay, and I understand there's also at a sort of slightly less large scale, you can go for LEED Campus, and there are other levels of certification available.
Yes, yeah. So LEED for Campus would be for a single kind of building owner. Let's say you've got like a corporate campus, like a pharma. Let's say you have a big pharma campus on an IDA project site and they have several buildings on one adjacent, you know, contiguous site. They could pursue LEED for Campus. And so we are looking at that at actually on the private level for LEED for Campuses, where there's private developments, where there's multiple buildings on a campus. And you may have one building on a campus that pursued LEED certification or that's pursuing LEED for O&M. And what that's done is opened up the picture into saying, well, should we be evaluating it at the campus level? So there is that, there are quite a few basically tech or pharma facility owners in Ireland who have registered projects on what we call the master site level. So a master site is your kind of baseline for the campus, and then buildings within that master site can achieve certification individually.
Super. A couple of questions here that have come in from the participants. Paul Connolly has asked, what type of additional elements are added to a building design where achieving LEED certification is also part of the design? I suppose that's a question that deserves a fairly long answer, but if you could give us the short and sweet version.
Okay, so what parts, what are kind of some things?
What's added to the building design?
Yeah, you know, some of the things that come up, like if we do LEED pre-assessments early on with design teams, often we find that buildings in Ireland would probably score well from a LEED perspective, regardless of whether they achieved the certification or not. And part of that is we have to remember that LEED is a universal rating system for every country in the world. And Ireland's building codes are more stringent than the LEED baseline. So all buildings in Ireland, new buildings, are already at an advantage when we look at them from a LEED assessment standpoint. They're already scoring pretty well. Some of the things that we find that need to be implemented are ventilation in corridors and public areas. In Ireland currently, there aren't requirements for ventilation in corridors and public areas, and maybe even then like lift lobbies and parking garages. So the LEED requirements for ventilation tend to be more stringent than the Irish building codes.
I suppose it's important to stress that one of the key things of LEEDs is that it's not individual building elements, it's the whole integrative process, and that involvement in the whole team from the very start in considering sustainability is key to it, isn't it?
Yes, and a big thing that we find also isn't necessarily addressed is materials procurement. So architects might specify certain materials, but then a contractor goes out and he might actually procure something else. And so one of our biggest tasks when we get involved from a LEED standpoint is just ensuring that what was specified is actually purchased and installed in the building. And that level of kind of oversight or kind of reviewing to make sure that what actually ends up in the building is what the design team intended, that's often falls through the cracks. And that's where the LEED rating system just gives a certain level of rigor to the documentation to say, did you use, if we specified a product because it has a low embodied carbon footprint, or because it's made from recycled content, or it's a healthy material that has low VOCs, we have to document, did those materials actually end up in the building? And so it's that rigor that's missing. That's kind of where we see the added value.
Okay. Next question comes from David Fitzgerald, and he's asking, how does one achieve LEED accreditation in old or Georgian buildings?
Yeah, well, it's possible. The interesting thing about LEED and the way it's set up is that for every building, you have to create your baseline model. And so the baseline model is a Georgian building. And so LEED doesn't make you have to compare yourself to a new building. You compare yourself to a Georgian building. And so your baseline is basically what the building is now. And so anything you do to improve upon the performance of the current state is captured in the LEED rating system. So, and there are very, with the reuse of existing buildings, there's actually credit in the LEED rating system for the fact that you're reusing the existing building, because you're not tearing it down and building a new building. So you're keeping that embodied carbon footprint of the structure itself. And so that's accounted for in the system, the fact that you're reusing an existing building. Probably the biggest hurdle would be getting over the ventilation requirements, because in existing buildings, the antiquated geometry of the building and maybe lower floor to floor height, you might not have a lot of good daylight, and you may not have, it might not be conducive to meeting the comfort criteria in LEED, because the LEED rating system not just looks at energy performance, but comfort of the occupants. So that's kind of the biggest challenge, is making sure it's a comfortable working environment that, meets the comfort criteria in LEED.
Okay, a couple more questions, Nellie. Lena Clark's asking, is the ARC data available to third parties? For example, how would valuers access it?
Well, the ARC platform communicates with other third-party data providers. So there's kind of a list of approved kind of platforms that communicate with ARC. So, if you were using some kind of tool that's used to capture your data, it can feed into the ARC platform. So I don't know that it's available to the general public, but it's available to other data providers.
And then Alex Trimbler's asked, are there any metrics on the base cost associated with achieving certification?
Well, the base cost of achieving LEED certification would be the actual registration and certification costs, which are on a cost per square foot basis. So, those administrative costs. There's also the cost of having a commissioning agent on board. So one of the prerequisites in LEED for buildings is having an independent third party kind of review the design and ensure that the building systems, the energy using systems in the building, are installed and up and running as per the original design intent. So the addition of that third party auditor and the rigor of the certification process itself are the major financial commitments.
My understanding, Nellie, is that actually in many cases the discipline of the integrative process of the team working together means that you're not adding cost. In fact, you may be reducing cost across the project by considering things in a more holistic way.
That's true, yes. So like one example could be, early on, if you're looking at doing rainwater harvesting on buildings, thinking about the roof design and how you're going to be capturing rainwater, how you're going to store it, how you're going to actually have the infrastructure in place to use captured rainwater for flushing. The earlier those things are discussed, then you save yourself down the line and maybe having to pursue other strategies that would have a higher cost premium.
Okay,
yeah,
that's great. And one final question, maybe before we wrap up for today. Declan has asked, have you looked at research on the relationship between sustainability and property market value? Which is a very interesting question.
Yeah, well, the GRESB reporting is really becoming a big thing now, because in terms of the valuation of properties, they're starting to, one of the factors that they look at is, do you have third-party building certifications? And that's getting factored into the whole valuation process. But also it sometimes comes back to the investors, the people who are investing in those projects are looking for, you know, the third-party building certifications. We just had a client last week ask us to fill out something that came in from their investors, asking them to prove that they are pursuing LEED Platinum on a building, because if they weren't pursuing LEED Platinum, they wouldn't have access to the funding. So there's definitely a connection there.
Okay, and then maybe I'll just wrap up with one final question, Nellie. How can we as construction professionals encourage our clients to think about the biodiversity considerations?
That's a tough one. It's hard to kind of convince people about things that you know, it really gets down to kind of a personal level of what matters to individuals and what matters to companies. But you know, we're in different times now, and I think that you know, there's a much more acute awareness to the impact buildings have on these things, and especially in the minds of millennials. If companies are thinking about what are people, it all comes back down to the people. So what are people looking for? They want to be aligned. They want to work for a company that cares about the same things they care about. And so maybe think about it that way, that if you want to have the best team working for you, and the best team is looking for companies that are aligned with their values, then there's the value for the company.
Okay, well, that's super. I have to thank you very much, Nellie, for your generous time today. Much appreciated. And thank you for your involvement with SCSI.
Great,
thank you to all the participants.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.